Okay, I think my screen is visible and I'm audible as well. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for everyone for being here to listen to this talk on the topic of breaking through bias in tech. My name is Muazma Zahid. I am a principal engineering manager at Microsoft, as I was introduced, and also president of a nonprofit called Pakistani Women in Computing. Really excited to talk to you about a topic which is near and dear to my heart. And you all are here either in afternoon or evening time for yourself. So there should be something related to this topic that excites something in your career journey. So really looking forward to a more interactive session. These slides are just there to just kind of start the conversation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on this webinar, and I'll try to get to them towards the end of this slide deck as well. So starting off with introduction, as already mentioned, there is my Linktree as well as LinkedIn and Twitter if you want to follow afterwards or connect with me. If you have any questions that I don't get time to today also, I'd be happy to do that. One fun fact about me is I have actually lived and worked in 5 different countries and 3 different continents. I'm a first-generation immigrant to the US and really passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at my workplace and outside of my workplace. That's why the topic of bias and inclusion and in general building inclusive technology is really important to me. So let's start about like what is bias. So I just want to level set. This is not a definition by me. This is an official definition from Oxford Dictionary. What is bias and what are the different types of bias? So there is if you understand a very high level difference, there is an explicit bias and there is an implicit bias. I'm not going to be talking about explicit bias. That's where you are aware of it and you know that this is the bias you have. I am going to be talking about the implicit or unconscious bias, and there is a really important reason to actually think about that, and I'm going to discuss that in a second. But what is bias it is something that you either favor or you go against. It could be a thing, it could be a person, it could be the whole group, and usually in a way that you're not aware of. So that's just a very simple way to put it. It could be the gender related, it could be age related, it could be the racial discrimination, religious discrimination, any propaganda, any of these reasons. And there could be not just one reason, but many of these reasons. And we are going to kind of dig deep into a little bit about some of the common biases and why we are talking about that when we are talking about technology, especially most of you who are women in technology, why it is important for you to know about them and how you can actually identify those and eventually reduce those biases in the systems or the code that you write. Did you know that humans actually make around 35,000 different decisions in a day on average? We almost kind of process 11 million bits of information every second. So human brains are very complex machines. We are wired in a way that we kind of take shortcuts. Those shortcuts are, for example, which toothbrush that you take to brush your teeth. There is a shortcut in your brain that does not let you actually even be aware of that decision when you're making that decision. So your brain is already wired in a way to take a shortcut towards what is your natural tendency of doing things. And so out of these 35,000 decisions, for example, for today, how many of those decisions do you even remember? So those are what I wanted to highlight are that more than 2/3 of those are unconscious and you don't really know that you are actually making those decisions. And why they're important is because those decisions can impact the decisions that you're making to build the code and eventually build the technology that everybody else is going to be using. So it's really important to kind of take a pause and understand that we all have a very complex system, and especially the way our brains are made. It's very important to identify that we all have these kind of biases in us. So that's the first thing, and that we all do several things throughout the day that impact those decisions, and most of those decisions are impacted by these biases, as I will explain in a second as well. So for example, when I was introduced here, or some of you already might know me or have seen me in some other event or some other place, it could be based, you might have a bias about me right now. It could be based on the color of my skin, the way I speak, how I was introduced, anything that you know about me already, or something new that you just learned in the last 5 minutes or so. So it could be n number of reasons. Again, as I mentioned, human brains are super, super complex, and they kind of take shortcuts, and you would actually tend towards the shortcut which is near dear to you. And I will just explain in one of the types of bias that why you did that and how you did that. So trying to give you a visual example as well, just so that a lot of people say, no, I'm not biased. I did not make this decision. I was not biased about this. In this picture, if you can put it in the chat, what do you see? Can you tell me, or do you know that the color of B and I is the exact same color of red, which is the color of A and S? And it is the same color of red, which is the background color of the word unconscious bias at the bottom of the screen. The reason why I wanted to show you this visual is to explain that even when you think you're not biased, you are already biased, because in this example, you have a tendency to think some way. However, the data does not actually show that that's the case. It is the lines on top of those words that is actually making it look different. And then you can add all the other complexities of people who have different ways of looking at things, people with different backgrounds, people with different ethnicities, and a lot of the other socioeconomic and other things that will add to this. So I'll take a pause here. I just want to kind of look at the chat and know a little bit more from your perspective. Before coming to this session, did you think that you were biased or not? If you thought yes, when you looked at this picture, what was your initial thoughts about that? Yeah. So I'm seeing in the chat about the black, blue, white dress thing. Yeah, definitely that was a good thing where a lot of people saw the same thing, but they perceived it in a different way. So that's a good way to look at it. So keep them coming in the chat, and I'll move on into different types of unconscious bias. And I just wanted to show you this visual so that you understand that this is a visual example of a particular perception that you have about an image. Now translating it in terms of the bias itself, right? So there are about 150 plus different types of unconscious bias that exist. I don't have infinite amount of time here today to go over each one of them, but I wanted to highlight a few of them, which we all carry, and we all have some form or shape of that. The first one is the beauty bias. So the people who we think are attractive, we tend to kind of judge them or consider their thoughts and the way they are presenting anything to be more valuable than the folks who we think are not attractive. And that definition of attractiveness is different for everyone. So this is one of the most common biases that exist. It exists in everyday walk of life. It exists in our hiring processes. It exists in different places. I just wanted to highlight one of the biases that we all go through. Especially on the social media and other places where you go, you have a certain tendency to tend towards certain people and take them as an authority versus certain people, and this bias has something to do with that. The other two types of bias, which are very, very common, affinity bias and conformity bias. So affinity bias is where you will tend to like the folks or like the decisions from the folks who look like you. For example, I have a certain background, I have a certain upbringing. If I go to that particular group of folks, I will tend to take their advice higher than anybody else. And that is affinity bias. Why this is dangerous or why this is a problem, especially in your hiring processes. For example, if you always tend to hire people like you, the workforce or the team is not going to be diverse. It's not going to present different opinions. So this is something that we all have at some level. And it's very, very hard to detect when you're making those decisions is that decision based on merit, or is a decision basically based on the bias of like this person looks like me, or this has a similar background like me, or a similar ethnic group or something like that. The next one is conformity bias. That's the bias where a lot of, especially women, I would say, tend to do because we conform to the traditions where we were brought in. For example, I'm from the Southeast Asia. We tend to be the nice ones in the room. We tend to be saying yes. We basically do not stand against the odds. And again, overgeneralizing, it's not true for everybody out there, but this is some of the norms in which kind of traditions, cultural stuff that we all grew up in. So conformity bias is where you have certain traditions around you, or the group, or let's say you follow a certain religion, you would conform to those ideologies, and then you will say yes to those things more than the other stuff. Again, why it is important is if you have to make a decision related to your work or the app that you're launching or the code that you're working on, and there is a situation where you conform to some of these things, you might take a decision which is not the decision you should be taking. The last two are my favorite ones. That's the kind of the thing I was just talking about, is the Hans effect and the halo effect. So in the first few seconds or first few minutes of when I started the presentation, if you had thought about something good about me, or read or heard something good, or something that resonated well with you from my past experience, or from the way I look or how I presented, you might be having a halo effect, which is good for me for this session. Or if, let's say, you picked up on something which was not good, or something that does not confines with the way you think about the world, or you perceived about this session, or anything like that, you might be having a Hans effect. So this is a good example of showcasing that in the first few minutes when you are interacting with somebody new, there's already certain biases that we have. And again, why it is important is, let's say you are interviewing, a data shows in the first 8 to 10 minutes, humans are actually taking the shortcuts already, and they actually make up their mind in the first 10 to 15 minutes about the person, of how the rest of the interview will go. So it's important that they understand, as an interviewer or an interviewee, to understand that we all have these biases, and how do you actually go about it, and what should we do. And again, we are going to talk about some of those things. And again, these are 5 examples. As I mentioned, there are 180 or 150 plus different types of biases. I have a link at the end that you can go and read up on. And definitely the LinkedIn course that I have out there has way more examples. So definitely go check that out if you have time to actually read up on this topic. So now the first thing, I just wanted to reset what we talked about. What is bias? What are the different types of bias? And then we went into talking about different types of these unconscious bias. These are in simple words are called cognitive bias. These are how brains work, and we all carry them. Now I want to go a little bit into the technical side of things and talk about algorithmic bias and data bias, and how that is important, and why that is important to actually think about when you are building algorithms, when you're taking data in, when you're doing machine learning, AI, any of these works at your workplace, and using that data and using that algorithms to build the technology that will be used or is currently used in different places. So on the screen, the left-hand side is one of my favorite examples. It's a famous one where machine learning algorithm is being trained on an image. It's almost impossible for it to know if it's a dog, or if it's a chihuahua or a muffin, because they almost look the same. For humans, it's really, really easy. I can go one by one and understand that. So imagine this, but like 100x more than that, because the data today is so much more. Just imagine a natural language processing, for example, which is with the algorithms which are trained on all of the data out there on Wikipedias and all of the stuff that you put out there in the internet. So there is a lot to actually go through, and for a machine learning algorithm or some algorithm like that to identify which ones of those are labeled correct, which ones are wrong, is really, really hard problem to solve. Again, I'm not going to go into those details here. The bias that can exist over there is, if you come from a particular background, you might think that this is okay to do that. For example, your right might not be the right I think of about certain things. So I don't want to go into the detail of the whole thing, how you should resolve the ethics issue and things like that. But there is this whole area where you have to understand that these biases exist in the data that we are generating. We are living in a world which is biased. So the data that we are generating is also biased. The right-hand example over here is taken from, the screenshot is taken from a gender classifier algorithm. You can see the largest gaps there between people with darker skin tone versus the people with a lighter skin tone. And you can see further between them is the difference between male and female. Again, we can debate on the reasons, we can talk about like why it happened, but fundamentally the data representation is missing. The data representation of all of the groups and all of the minority groups, and especially all of the folks who don't have the same access like other folks is missing from the technology that we are building. Again, this is a field of research. This is a field a lot of people are working and spending a lot of hours on, and I will be sharing some resources with all of you to go and do some of the homework for yourself as well. Some of the other examples of algorithmic bias, these are the common ones. One of the ones which is always in the news or some shape form is the facial recognition, where we have several examples where people with darker skin tone or a certain age or beyond certain age are not recognized correctly as compared to a certain category of folks who are always accurate, or these algorithms are always accurate. Again, the reason is that when you're building the whole process, it's actually optimized for that data set. And it works really well in the testing and even in production systems. But once you take that to wide variety of folks and make it available to a broader audience, that's where these systems fail. Some of the other ones, one of the common ones is the online recruiting system. So starting from the systems which actually screen the resumes to the whole process of hiring, where you put out job descriptions which are not inclusive, having non-inclusive words there, actually causes bias for the folks, and they are not, like a lot of people with certain backgrounds might even not apply to those roles, because if you have gender terms, you have certain types of stereotypes like gurus and things like that in job description. Data already shows and research shows that people who don't basically come from the same background might not apply to even roles. So you're already filtering those people, even giving them, like before even giving them a chance to get their foot into the door. And why it is important is if you don't have diverse workforce, the data and the work and the technology that you're building is not going to be inclusive. It's not going to reflect the world that we live in, and it's going to continue to, it's a cycle that will continue on and on and on. But bias in word association, this is one of my favorite, and I'm a mother of 3 girls. So personally, when I go to toy shop, for example, there is a clear stereotype that we see early on. And again, there's a whole research area in this, where by the age of 9, we already have built certain stereotypes in the kids that are of the age 9 or even below that. For example, there are toys that showcase certain things like the building stuff is for boys, and let's say kitchen stuff or something about cooking and all of that is for girls. Again, I have nothing against this stereotype. I'm just taking an example that this is what a lot of time what happens by the age of 9, the kid already is thinking that this is what I'm good at and this is what I'm going to do when I grow up. And that's why I think I was laughing at the initial question. I think when you're growing up, you have a different view of the world, and as you grow up, you realize that you can do anything. Like the world is your oyster. So it's important that you understand. And again, going back to the bias, the words associations in your everyday kind of interaction is really something that you can think about. The next things is about online ads. So today, if you go on the internet, if you search software engineers in terms of images, you would find a 9 out of 13 images to be male in this example. Again, this is example of gender bias, where that's not the reality of the world. If it's not 50-50, it is getting to go there eventually. That's not represented. And then if you go further down and dig that, I'm a data person. So if you look into more details about certain ethnic groups, certain people with certain backgrounds, the data disparity, the gap, you will see more and more and more. So these are some examples. There are many more examples. Most of the sensors, for example, when you go and try to wash your hands, they might not detect those because of the color of your skin. There are so many examples, and in the worst case scenario, there are examples like who is stopped by the police and the criminal justice system and all of that. So there are so many adverse effects if you don't stop these systems early on in the process and start building inclusive technology, starting from the people to the process to eventually the technology that you're building. And these are the 3 steps you have to think throughout the life cycle of the product that you're building. Regardless of whatever level you are and whichever company you are, because all of you are dealing with code, so you're always building something. So it's important to start looking at the people, the process, and eventually the technology that you're building or the code you're writing. Next, I wanted to quickly talk about data bias. So again, I will do a quick recap of what I have talked about so far. So we started with what is bias, like what is the definition of bias. We went into some of the common unconscious biases that we have, like cognitive bias. Then we went and talked about algorithmic bias and talked about a few examples of algorithmic bias. Again, so far, all of the things that I've talked about is bad news. So I'm going to eventually talk about how you can build more inclusive systems as well. But we talked about unconscious bias or cognitive bias. We talked about algorithmic bias, and now I'm focusing about data bias. So on the screen, there are 4 examples of data bias that we see every single day. And there are so many others. Again, these are some examples out of the list of many. The most common is association bias. This is mostly what I already described in terms of gender-based. It could be stereotyping. This is a common kind of output of that. You will see association, for example, if the data you're collecting, all the nurses are always female, you might think that the algorithm might think that the male cannot be nurses, for example, or vice versa. So depending on where you're collecting those data sources, what is the association you're building in that data source, that will actually build a system which will not be inclusive. So it's very important to understand that relationship when you are collecting the data. Exclusion bias is the next one, where we, as engineers, actually exclude piece of information thinking that either it is irrelevant or it will not make an impact on the solution that we are doing. Again, this could be based on the surveys that you do. This could be based on a particular subset or a cohort that you have coming in, thinking that this is nothing to do with them. And eventually you'll find out in production that this app or something that you build is actually really used by that section of the population. So exclusion bias is a common one in data, where you exclude a certain piece of information thinking it's not relevant or it's not applied to the code that you're building. The next one is a sample bias. This is also very common, where you collect data about certain thing. It could be a survey again, it could be any of the data that you're collecting as part of your research. And then your sample is very narrow, or the sample does not reflect the world that we live in. One of the very basic example of that is your beta tester. So when you are doing an app and then or something that you're building, you have a population who's already subscribed as a beta tester, and that's the population you send the early bits to and get their feedback to actually improve before you release it to everyone. Most of the time, these beta testers are the folks who are tech savvy, who already know what to do. They have either tested stuff with you before. There's a very subset of folks that are already subscribed, and there are different ranking systems and things like that for them. And their focus is to find bugs in the code, which is good, but they do not represent the real world. They do not represent the world this app or the application is eventually going to be used. So this is a very basic example of where sample bias and the data collected from those folks is not accurate in that sense, which will represent the world where the application is actually going to be used. Last one is measurement bias, where, for example, if you're using a vision detection model, you might have a camera which is of a certain DPI that is taking pictures. And you use those images to train your vision detection. But when you deployed your model, your machine learning model, anything like that in production, the camera over there, let's say, has very low resolution. It's not even able to get the images at that quality. So right away, you'll find a lot of issues with the applications that you've just built. This is one example where things, when you measure them during the code testing, is different versus production. And that's totally different based on different parameters of whatever applications that you're building. So these are some examples of, again, data bias. There's so many more. The purpose of this talk is to just kind of put some seeds in your head to think about these things when you are building technology. And then we'll share some resources also where you can go and do some more research about these, especially if any of those actually relate to the work that you do in your day job and actually build any of the applications that collect data or do something with the algorithms or actually build some apps or front end, back end, whatever you do in that case. How can you think about bias when you're building these things throughout the process? So I will leave this on the screen. If in the chat, if you can tell me, do you think there is any difference, first of all, between the two? And do you think one is biased versus the other? Just maybe answer in the chat. What do you think? And do you notice the difference between these two survey questions? Yep. Yeah, the first one is bias. So yeah, that is spot on. So the way you are actually putting your questions out for survey is already indicating the kind of results you want from that survey. So the first question right there, it has a bias or tendency towards saying that you like the account setup. Again, if that's what you want, that's fine, but ideally that shouldn't be the case. So alternative to that would be you ask the person or ask the customer, how do you rate the satisfaction of account setup or the feature or whatever your question is. So the example, this is a very simple thing. Again, a lot of us don't like to do surveys, but as part of product development, if you are a PM especially, you know, the process is to get a lot of feedback, even internal, sometimes external, beta testing, all of that. And we do a lot of kind of data collection in that. And then once you collect this data, you make decisions. So let's say in your survey that you put this question, how much do you like? A lot of people, because it's talking about like, they would tend to answer in that way. And you might think that this is the data which represents the world, right? So again, you will make some decisions based on the answers that you've got in the survey. So it's important again to think about, there are two types of bias actually in this vector. One is you have certain inclination. Second is the result itself. Once you measure it, it's different than the reality of the world because you're already putting towards likeness versus thinking about that some people might never like it. So what should they do? And like most of the people like that might even not fill this survey. So this is again a research area where you can think about how the words that you put out there have an influence on the folks when they're making decisions. And this is a very simple example. Just imagine this to the systems that you're building at large and how that can influence and how do you see and perceive certain information when you see on certain app or certain technology that you're using every single day. Social media is a great example. So far, we talked about all of the different biases. We talked about algorithmic bias, we talked about data bias, we also talked about cognitive bias, and also some of the examples in these biases. So as I said, this was all bad news. So what can you do? What can we do, right? I'll start by saying this is something, again, started the session with this, that we are all biased. The very first step is that you should recognize, I should recognize, everybody should recognize that we are all biased. Even if we try to kind of be more, I would say, thoughtful in the processes of our brain and take those steps, it's scientifically, it's not possible to completely remove bias from us because, as I said, human brains are super complex and there are several layers of information that we process, and some of those processing systems, if you are in IT, you know that it's really hard to actually dissect where the decision was actually made and what was the reason why you made a certain decision. So the first thing is to realize that we are all biased, and if anybody says they're not, please have a conversation with me offline and I would like to talk to you. The second is, and I have a resource at the end, which is a bias test that you all can go and take today. It is anonymous one. It's called implicit bias test that you can take today, and it will give you a very good idea of certain categories of bias, and it will give you some results. Again, the data collected over there is anonymous as well. The second one is when you're making decisions is to think critically and challenge the assumptions. There's this stat that when you are presenting a certain figure, let's say I say 85% of people do this or 75% people do this, in a setting like this or any of the workplace setting where a person is considered authority on a particular topic, there is a tendency to believe in that. And a lot of people will not challenge that. They would think that this is the reality. So when you are presented with any data point, the couple of things you should always do is challenge the assumptions and then challenge the research method, challenge how this data was collected, what was done with it after it was collected, how many different types of sources were considered when you collected this data, and then this list goes on and on and on. So definitely challenge those assumptions and in certain situations, the traditions that you have or the workplace settings or the culture that you have in your company also, because that might be going into this process of never-ending bias that's going into everything that you're doing. Then words are important. So in the example previously, as I mentioned in the survey example, words were really important. The way you put the sentences out is important. The way you write your code is also important, and then I will talk about that in the next slide. But the way you associate things in certain ways, there is a lot of debate about like saying guys to everyone and all of that. I don't want to go into that debate here, but the point is that what you say and what you do has a linkage with the kind of bias you have. So the more attentive you are to those things, the more conscious you are about that, the less the bias would exist in the long run. And this is a journey. It will not end today. It will not be gone in any time in future, but you can work on it to actually reduce it in the long run from the decisions that you're making every single day. Last but not least, when you are having a strong reaction, when you have a certain set of mind about certain things, for example, you are in an interview and the person said something and you have a very strong reaction to that, please hit pause and then basically shortcut that, cut that cord of that shortcut brain that you have, which is taking a decision to actually be towards the bias test. So hit a pause and think about it. There's a really good book called Thinking Fast and Slow. It is a very famous book on this topic. You can read about it. It has several methods of how you can actually use and train your brain to hit pause when you have these strong reactions, when you have these strong kind of decisions that you make at your work. Some of those are really good because they are doing it for the right reason, but always think about taking a pause and then taking the actions. And you'll see over time that you will recognize more about your biases, your thinking process, and why you're saying X versus Y as well. Next, from engineering perspective, coding perspective, or building technology, these are the few things that you should think about. Again, from organization's perspective, if you are in hiring, starting, as I said, it starts with the people. If you have the right folks in the team, if you have good, better kind of representation, there is a higher chance. And again, McKinsey's study and many other studies show that the more inclusive the workforce is, the less biased the systems are, less problems are there like that. So starting from the tech recruitment, I already talked about a few places where you can think about, starting from the job descriptions to the hiring panel. Again, the data shows that if you have a certain set of people represented on hiring panels, they would be hiring similar people like them, right? So the affinity bias will kick in, a few other types of biases will kick in. So having more diverse hiring panels is another way to actually attract diverse talent as well. Resume systems, again, this could be a talk in itself. The way ATS systems work, there was a very famous example of this when Amazon made a mistake in their machine learning algorithm, which was corrected very fast afterwards. But this is a common thing as well, where these systems, when they are built, they have a particular type of bias towards certain things, and those biases can impact the decisions how you recruit somebody. So starting from the people, that's the most important thing. Then is the process, and then eventually the technology. So in terms of process, surveys, as I mentioned, is a very good example. The other thing is making these features accessible. I don't have enough time to talk about that today, but the whole area of accessibility, people with different abilities, how do you think about them when you're building technology? That's the whole area of research, a whole area of kind of product building, what you should think when you are building that. And then as software programmers, for example, the inclusive language in your code is also very important. Terminologies like whitelist or master list or things like that. There was a huge debate on GitHub related to that. So ideally, they shouldn't be there in this age and era, but they're still there. The question is, how can we try to remove these things from our code, the code that we are building, and then build more inclusive technology? The last two, data bias, we already talked extensively about the data bias, examples of data bias. There are so many others. I can definitely share more links afterwards, and at the end of this also with you. So definitely think about all of these different types of data bias that exist, and then build data governance systems and checks and balances of how data is gathered, what are you doing with data, and what are you doing next with it. Last but not least, this is a recent, I would say, in the last 2 to 5 years, this area is kind of growing super fast, where responsible AI practices are really, really important. Most of the big players or organizations have already put out their frameworks, but it is one thing to put those frameworks out. It's the second thing to actually use those frameworks when you're building the technologies and when you're building those machine learning models. So things about fairness, accountability, reliability, transparency, all of those are the terms. And again, you can go to the LinkedIn Learning course, which is at the bottom of the screen here, to learn more about some of these things as the next steps to go and be more aware about these things and how you can actually inform yourself to build a better code, more inclusive technology, and eventually a world which is more inclusive as well. I would like to leave you all with this this message. This is something I truly believe in, that every conversation that you go to, every meeting you go to, every interaction that you have either at work or outside of your work, it is an opportunity to actively listen and listen to just listen, not to answer back. There's a difference between those. And empower and cultivate inclusion. So you, no matter what level you are, what you do, it's important that you be that ambassador and start with your work, with your team, with the code that you're working on, and take it to the next level from that point onward. With that, we'll share some resources here. The first one is the LinkedIn Learning course. Next is the test that I talked about. You can take a screenshot. We'd be happy to share that afterwards with all of you as well. There are a few examples of the solutions that you can use to actually look at job descriptions to make them less biased. And then there are links where you can connect with me as well. So I think we have a few minutes here, and that's all I had for you today. So let's all kind of pledge today that we will start with the work that we do, looking at bias from this angle and understand where bias exists in ourselves. Then starting with the people to the process, eventually the products that you're building, and work towards more inclusive technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Muazma. So like Muazma said, we do have some time for questions. So you can feel free to put them in the put them in the chat box or use the Q&A feature. We have a few moments, and I'll be looking and helping here. Let's see. Any questions? Well, I actually have a question, if that's okay for you. I think, thank you for the talk. I think one thing that is always a question on my mind is if you have any strategies to get buy-in from like colleagues or leaders, you know, if you're a kind of a lower level engineer, to help. How do you get buy-in about these topics if maybe the higher ups are not ready to hear them right now?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think most of this works, so I've seen it both ways in my career. So I've seen top-down approaches and also the bottom-up approach or the root level approach. I think the more successful is where the teams or the root level are kind of buy in, and then the major blocker is middle management. That's where I've seen these things kind of die. So your question about how you can get those buy-ins, I can suggest a couple of ideas. One of them is to show them some of the studies or the data that's already out there, especially with the code that you are building. Just take it to a diverse audience, get their feedback, and share that difference with you. You'll see very quickly that there is a very different type of opinions when you take that data from a diverse pool of customers versus the set of customers that you always think about as the number one. The second suggestion I can give you is I am most of the, like we do in our code base, we have actually a style check kind of checks So before anybody creates a PR in the GitHub, we actually have a checklist where people have to say, yes, that I did this, I did this, I did this. So that's an explicit way of them saying, yeah, I looked at my code and it is inclusive. I have not used any of these terminologies. And then we have automated systems that can find and detect those and trigger certain types of issues also if there is there. So you can mandate things like that. Again, you might need some buy-in to actually go there, but one quick way would be just going and just doing a scan of the current code and showing them how much of that is existing already, right? That's one thing. And then the one thing that has always helped is the support. If your, let's say, management is not doing that, maybe you go to your stakeholders, maybe you go to other product groups, work with them to actually create the case, and then that sometimes also helps. So those are some suggestions I can give you. I'm a very data person, so I always go back to collect the data, show the difference, and then take it to the leadership and say, this is what I examined and this is what I see as a trend in my team or the teams that I work with.
We have a question here. That's a great one. So it's from Navati. What is a good resource to consult when you want to ensure your language is inclusive? Especially since, as she points out, some terms may sound inclusive at first, but there's still a lot of discussion. And the example is women with an X.
Yeah.
It's definitely something we all think about a lot.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it starts with inventorying your own kind of list of things that you say. For example, there was a long time ago that I used to say, again, taking a very simple example, again, we can debate on it all day long, where I used to say a lot when I go to meeting, hi, hey guys, what is up? Hey guys, do you want to do this? Hey guys, that's nice. It took an intentional effort from my side to actually take a pause and start saying guys. Now I say folks. To be more inclusive to anyone. Again, we can debate if that's because of the way I was brought up or the way I had human bias. Again, some people might think it's okay to say that. That's all okay. So I'm not going to debate on that side, but it takes an effort for you to first recognize that that's the case, and that's the word or the set of terminologies which you shouldn't be doing or you shouldn't be taking if you think they're not inclusive. Again, your view and my view might never be the same. So you might think saying certain thing is okay, and I might think that's not okay. What in terms of workplace you can do is you can have certain team agreements. So we do this thing in our team where we have, as I said, like it's eventually a checklist that we have added to our code base where everybody goes through the same scan, and those are the list of things everybody has to abide by. Then if there are more things that need to be added, they feel okay to kind of bring them up, and then you can add them to the list. There are a certain, again, as part of my LinkedIn Learning course, there is a link, I can try to find it right now as well, but there is a link where there are some standard definitions of some of these terminologies which are not inclusive. And that list is also evolving over time. So you can, I would just answer it in a simple way. You start with something basic, and then you evolve into the next thing and to the next thing, and then realize that it's a journey. You will not turn into an inclusive person or inclusive technology like the next day, but you can take steps to actually start reducing it, and then eventually be more inclusive in the long run. So if you want to start with, let's say, the woman with an X, that could be a good step today. And tomorrow, if there's another thing you want to add to your checklist of things, that's something you can do. And again, it will take an intentional effort to stop using a previous thing that you used to use, right? So that will be a journey for you that you might have to go through.
I'm going to head to the Q&A now, and someone's sharing their experience. If our HR asks us to take more background checks than our peers for the same project, for example, how can we work with HR in a way that's professional but still firm?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly, the background checks in certain ways could be it could be an extreme case where this is because of a discrimination that you're facing. Then definitely in an organization that the process is you have to go to HR, but HR is the person, HR is the one who's causing it, in this case. So you might have to think about ways to work around it. In the case of background checks, I'm not 100% sure if this is a standard background checks that everybody has to go through. And how do you know that that's more than the rest of the folks? So a little bit clarity on that might help me answer this question. But just understanding this on a very high level, if there are certain, for example, in my work, we have a certain level of background checks that happen for folks who worked on cleared projects, who work on a certain set of projects which has sensitive data. So there is another set of checks that happens for those folks. And when we are hiring in that, sometimes during the hiring process, they don't know they're actually getting hired for that roles. So that could be a reason as well. Sometimes some of those checks are because of process thing that a company has been following for a long time. So I would start by challenging that process and saying, like, this is why we are doing it, right? Well, what is the benefit of doing it? And does it actually helps the company in the long run, helps the company to build more inclusive technology, or is it something that we've always done that's why we are doing it? So if it's the latter, you should definitely bring up that with your leadership and other teams to kind of work through that. So those are some suggestions I can give. I don't have the whole context of this question, but sometimes those checks could be because of the right reasons. Sometimes they could be because of a clear discrimination. There are different routes you can take based on what type of situation you are actually in.
So we have time for two more questions that I see here. So Eric asks, breaking through biases is definitely helped by having many perspectives at the table, but many tech fields are historically inequitable, so it can be hard to find those diverse perspectives. So how do you break through biases from within that biased population?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thanks, Eric, for asking that. So I think going back to the statement previously, as I mentioned, it's a journey. So you start with yourself first to identify what are the biases you have, right? So a lot of time we say, yeah, we are biased, but we don't really make an effort to understand what types of biases do I carry every single day. Again, you might not be able to go through the whole list of 180, 150 plus biases, but you can start with a few common ones that we all have, like recency bias, where something recent you have heard, so you have an influence on that, or things like that. Affinity bias and other bias that I already mentioned. So start with inventorying your bias for yourself. And in my case, I actually kind of write down some of those things. I actually examine a couple of weeks of the meetings that I go to and what I talk about. And I write down, like, I reflect upon that and see, like, where I think I made a certain decision and why I think I made that decision. And that reflection helps you kind of know that. So that's for your own self. Once you've identified some of those, at least the behaviors or the things that impact the technology you're building, you can start noticing that for others as well in your team. A simple way is to bring that up, having a very honest conversation that this is something you said in the other day in that meeting, which I thought was not appropriate or not inclusive. So let's talk about that. That's one way. So that's how the existing let's say non-diverse population that you already have, you can make them aware of those biases as well. I know a lot of organizations have bias training now. Some of them are mandatory for interviewers, for example. Some of them have very good processes in place. Again, training is one thing, and then actually practicing is another thing, right? So going back to the quote at the end of my slides, I think every conversation, every meeting you go to, you basically model the behavior for the rest of your team and the culture you have. So starting with those two things, starting with your own kind of inventory of your biases, then noticing those things in the teams that you work with, and then taking out certain actions on those, like starting with the language that you have in your code, or the processes of how you collect your data, the governance around the data. Those could be good steps to start with. Again, there is a lot more you can do in the long run, especially if you're building machine learning stuff and AI stuff, where there could be frameworks and stuff that you could go through. So I would just start with those. And one thing I do want to mention is, like, even if you are in a field which is not diverse, the typical diversity definition is not just gender. There's so much more, right? There's intersectionality of everything else, right? So I have at least 5 or 6 different types of kind of intersection of different things. So I mentioned I'm a first generation immigrant. I am there's so many other things. I have a certain age group, I have a certain religion, I have a certain thing. So if the combination of that, so if you look around your teams and your workplace, you will find that that is still there. And how important it is to understand that is also something that can build a culture which is more inclusive in the long run. So I'll start with myself. I'll start looking at those trends in my team, and I'll start with some of the processes in my team or immediate team to start reflecting those and taking that to the broader audience after that.
Thank you. So one final quick question, just for a quick takeaway for the engineers and coders. Can you just remind us at which step of your process do you go over that checklist that you described before? Like, is it during code review, design review, or is there some other step so that, and then people can take that to their teams tomorrow?
Yeah, so we do that actually when you create a PR. So even before the code review, when you're checking in your code, there is that, what is that, like the README of that, where you actually put in the stuff. So there is a check over there where you have to check mark that you went through this and this is where, and we also do a scan at that time. So at that time, before even the code gets merged, you can work on your branch as long as you want, but if you want to try to merge into and create a PR, that's where we create that, and that's the step. After that, there is the code review and all of the other steps, and we go through that afterwards. But this is before the code review, and when you're actually trying to create a PR for your code.
Well, thank you so much. I'm putting one final link in the chat. So thank you, Gracia, but thank you so much. And thank you, Muazma, and learning for joining us tonight and having a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.